The freight wagon lurched to a stop, and Clara descended into Pine Ridge's dust like a ghost materializing from Oregon's wilderness. 3 months she'd traveled, shedding her surname somewhere between Kansas and the Columbia River. Mrs. Holloway's boarding house stood weathered but respectable, its windows reflecting the endless sawmill smoke. 3 months' rent, Clara said, pressing coins into the widow's palm before questions could form. In her sparse room, Clara unpacked everything she owned: 2 calico dresses, a worn Bible, and inexplicably, a child's wooden horse. She couldn't explain why she'd kept it carved by her husband before rage consumed him, meant for a baby who never drew breath. Through thin walls came the rhythmic thunder of axes, the bellowing songs of lumberjacks. She pressed her palm against the window, watching massive pines fall like titans. Here, perhaps, she could disappear. The toy horse watched from her nightstand, waiting. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Like Saturday morning arrived with the peculiar energy that market days brought to Pine Ridge. Clara had avoided the weekly gathering for 3 weeks, subsisting on boarding house meals and whatever Mrs. Holloway could spare from her pantry. But necessity finally drove her out. She needed salt pork, cornmeal, and the dozen small things that made a room feel less like a cage. The marketplace sprawled across the town square, a maze of canvas-covered stalls and wagon beds laden with goods. Farmers from the valley brought vegetables and preserves, while the company store set up tables of dry goods and tools. Clara pulled her shawl tight despite the warmth, hoping to remain invisible among the bonneted wives and weathered lumberjacks. She moved deliberately through the crowds, selecting provisions with careful economy. 3 pounds of cornmeal, a precious cone of sugar wrapped in blue paper, salt pork that would keep through the warming days ahead. At the pickle barrel, she considered the luxury of spending 2 pennies more, her fingers hovering over the coins in her purse. The child appeared like a thunderbolt. One moment Clara stood contemplating pickles. The next, a small body slammed into her skirts with the force of absolute certainty. Arms wrapped around her legs, a face buried deep in the folds of her dress, and a voice young, desperate, wondering whispered a single word that froze the blood in her veins. "Mama." The marketplace stuttered to a halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the chickens in their crates seemed to pause their clucking. Clara looked down at the boy, 7, maybe 8 years old, with sandy hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water. He gazed up at her with such complete recognition that her knees nearly buckled. "Child, Her voice failed. Around them, a circle formed. She recognized Mrs. Patterson from church, mouth agape. Tom Chen had stopped loading his wagon. Everyone stared. "Papa dreams about you," the boy said, his grip tightening. "He sees you when he sleeps. You came. You really came." "Samuel!" A man's voice cracked like a whip across the square. Clara looked up to see him pushing through the crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying an axe like it weighed nothing. Sawdust clung to his dark hair, and his face carried the permanent tan of a man who worked under sky. This had to be the father, though his expression held more shock than anger. "Samuel, let go of the lady." But the command held no force. The man, Tom. She heard someone whisper, stared at Clara as if seeing his own ghost. "She's the dream lady, Papa." Samuel's voice rang with conviction. "The one who smells like apple blossoms and rain. The one Mama said would come." The crowd pressed closer. Clara felt their curiosity like heat from a stove, their need for explanation, for scandal, for something to discuss over Sunday dinners. Her hands trembled as she gently touched the boy's head. His hair was soft, sun-warm, exactly the texture she'd imagined her own child's would have been. "I don't know this child," she said carefully, though the words felt like swallowed glass. "But he seems to know me." Tom reached them, his presence creating a small space in the crowd. Up close, she could see the grief etched in the lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man perpetually braced for the next blow. He knelt beside Samuel, his large hands remarkably gentle on the boy's shoulders. "Sam," This isn't your mama is gone. You know that. Not my first mama, Samuel said patiently, as if explaining something obvious to a slow student. My next mama, the one from the dreams, the one who was coming to find us. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the murmur. This is unnatural. What kind of woman? The kind who stands here while a child clings to her, instead of running. Tom said quietly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Ma'am, I apologize for my boy. He's been, since his mother passed 2 years back. He gets notions. Clara found herself kneeling too, bringing herself to Samuel's level. The boy immediately pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture so intimate, so trusting, that tears pricked her eyes. What did your mama tell you about this dream, lady? She asked softly. That she would be sad but getting better. That she would know how to make Papa laugh again. That she would smell like apple blossoms and rain. He pulled back slightly, studying her face with those impossible eyes. You do. You smell exactly right. Clara's hand went involuntarily to her throat. This morning, like every morning for 3 years, she'd dabbed apple blossom water there, the last bottle from her mother's things, her only luxury. Tom's face had gone pale beneath the sawdust. Emma used to say in her fever dreams, near the end, she talked about someone coming. I thought it was the laudanum. The crowd had grown. Half the town seemed to be watching now, this impossible tableau of strangers bound by a child's certainty. Clara could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge she could stand. Apologize. Flee to her room and pack within the hour. Or she could lean into whatever strange providence had brought her here, to this moment, to this child who looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd whispered into the dark. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should talk somewhere less public. Your son seems upset. Samuel laughed, actually laughed. I'm not upset. You're here. Everything's going to be right now. Tom stood slowly, offering Clara his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His palm was calloused, warm, steady. Samuel immediately claimed her other hand, and for a moment they stood there, connected, while Pine Ridge watched and whispered and wondered. My boarding house isn't far, Clara offered. Mrs. Holloway's. Tom seemed relieved. She's good people. Fair. They began walking, Samuel between them, still gripping Clara's hand like she might evaporate. The crowd parted, their whispers following like smoke. Clara caught fragments. Never seen anything like. That boy always was different. Widow from nowhere. As they reached the boarding house steps, Samuel looked up at her with those extraordinary eyes. I knew you'd come. Mama promised. Clara's heart cracked a little wider, letting in light she'd thought lost forever. Mrs. Holloway's parlor had never felt smaller. Clara sat on the worn settee. Samuel pressed against her side, his small hand still entwined with hers as if releasing it would break some spell. Tom occupied the ladder-back chair across from them, his large frame making the furniture appear child-sized. He kept turning his hat in his hands, the brim already shapeless from his nervous fingers. I should apologize again, Tom began, but Mrs. Buttercup Holloway bustled in with a tea tray, cutting him short. No need for apologies in my house, the older woman said firmly, setting down china teacups with hairline cracks that spoke of years of service. Boy's got a gift, always has. Knew when the Paulson baby was coming 2 days before the labor started. Knew when that tree was going to fall last winter. Saved 3 men by refusing to let his papa work that section. She poured tea with practiced efficiency, the kerosene heater humming softly in the corner. The room smelled of bergamot and the apple tart cooling in the kitchen. Clara accepted her cup gratefully, though her hands trembled slightly against the delicate porcelain. Samuel, Tom said gently, you need to let Mrs. He paused, realizing he didn't know her surname. Clara, she supplied. Just Clara. You need to let Miss Clara have her hand back. She might need it for her tea. Samuel shook his head, pressing closer. She won't stay if I let go. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Clara felt her throat tighten. How did this child know her impulse to run? The flight that lived in her bones. I'm not going anywhere just now, she said softly. I promise. Slowly, reluctantly. Samuel released her hand but remained pressed against her side. He studied her face with those remarkable eyes, as if memorizing every line and shadow. You've been sad a long time, he announced. Not a question, a statement of fact. Clara's breath caught. She looked at Tom, expecting to find judgment, but saw only weary understanding. Mrs. Holloway settled into her rocking chair, picking up her knitting but clearly listening. Yes, Clara admitted. I have been. Papa's sad too, Samuel continued. Since Mama went to heaven, he tries to hide it, but I know. He doesn't sing anymore. Tom's jaw tightened. Sam, it's all right, Clara interrupted. She recognized the boy's need to speak truths adults danced around. Sometimes sadness becomes so familiar we forget what it was like before it arrived. She hesitated, then made a decision. These people deserved some truth, even if not all of it. I lost a child once. Stillborn. A son. The words came out rough, unused. My husband blamed me, said I was cursed. Things became difficult after that. Mrs. Holloway's knitting needles clicked faster, her mouth setting in a hard line. She'd seen enough of the world to fill in the blanks Clara left. Is that why you came west? Tom asked carefully. My husband died 6 months ago. Lumber accident. Ironically enough, Clara traced the edge of her teacup. His family wanted to keep me close, manage my choices. I thought distance might help me breathe again. Samuel tugged at her sleeve. You still smell like the dream lady. Apple blossoms and rain. You keep saying that, Clara said. Tell me about these dreams. The boy's face lit up. Papa has them too, but he pretends not to. Mama started talking about you when she got sick. She said a lady would come who needed us as much as we needed her. She said you'd have dark hair with silver starting at the temples, see, right there. He touched Clara's temple where, indeed, premature silver streaked through the brown. She said you'd have hands that knew how to hold broken things without breaking them more. Clara looked at her hands, ordinary hands, she'd always thought. Hands that had held her stillborn son for 3 precious hours. Hands that had learned to defend against her husband's rages. Hands that had packed everything she owned into a single carpet bag. Emma was often feverish near the end, Tom said quietly. The doctor said she might have visions, but she was so certain, so specific. She made me promise to be kind when you arrived, made me promise not to turn you away. She drew pictures, Samuel announced. Want to see? Before anyone could respond, he was up and at the window, pointing. Our cabin's just past the mill, the one with the blue door. Papa painted it blue because Mama loved the color. All her pictures are in the Bible box. Samuel, we can't just... Tom started. I'd like to see them. Clara heard herself say, if you wouldn't mind. Tom studied her for a long moment. Behind his exhaustion, she saw something else hope. Perhaps. Or at least the absence of the suspicion she'd expected. After supper, Mrs. Holloway declared. You'll all stay for supper. I've got pot roast that needs eating and that apple tart that's begging for company. She fixed Tom with a look that brooked no argument. That boy needs a proper meal. And from the look of you, so do you. Working yourself to bones won't bring her back. No, ma'am, Tom agreed quietly. The meal passed in a strange domesticity. Samuel chattered about the lumber camp, about school starting soon, about the family of foxes living under their porch. He directed most of his conversation to Clara, as if making up for lost time. Occasionally, his hand would dart out to touch her arm, confirming her continued presence. As Mrs. Holloway served the tart, Samuel's energy began to flag. By the time the dishes were cleared, he was fighting yawns. Clara found herself shifting automatically to accommodate his drowsing weight against her shoulder. The rightness of it terrified her. Tom watched them with an expression she couldn't decipher. Pain, certainly, but something else, too. He hasn't. Not since Emma. He doesn't trust easily anymore. Neither do I, Clara admitted. Samuel mumbled something into her shoulder, already more asleep than awake. Without thinking, Clara began humming an old lullaby her mother had sung, one she'd planned to sing to her own child. Tom went very still. That song. Clara stopped. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Emma hummed it. All the time. Said her grandmother taught it to her. But I'd never heard it before or since. His voice was barely a whisper. How could you know it? Clara's hands trembled as she held the sleeping child. I don't know. I don't understand any of this. Mrs. Holloway set down her knitting. Some things aren't meant for understanding. Boy knows something we don't, maybe something we can't. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Clara looked at Samuel's peaceful face, at Tom's desperate hope, at her own hands holding this child she'd never met but somehow recognized. He could visit, she said carefully, after school, if you're comfortable with that. I could help with letters and sums. He'd like that, Tom said. We both would. Samuel stirred, murmuring, She's staying. Papa, I told you she'd stay. Clara met Tom's eyes over the boy's head. An agreement passed between them, fragile, temporary, but genuine. Whatever strange providence had brought them together, they would let it unfold slowly, carefully, with the tender confusion of people who'd forgotten how to trust but were willing to try. The braided rug under Clara's feet felt solid, real. Through the muslin curtains, she could see the first stars appearing over the lumber camp, somewhere in this strange new life, between the daguerreotype photographs on the mantel and the sleeping child in her arms. She felt the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. It terrified her. It gave her hope. Most of all, it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but was brave enough to wait for. The rhythm of their days began with Samuel's footsteps on the boarding house stairs. Each morning at 7:30, just after the mill whistle announced the first shift, he would appear at Clara's door with something clutched in his small hands, wildflowers picked on the way, an interesting rock. Once a beetle in a jar that Mrs. Holloway firmly banished to the porch. 2 weeks had passed since the marketplace encounter, and Pine Ridge had shifted from suspicious watching to cautious acceptance. Clara had expected resistance, judgment, perhaps even hostility. Instead, she found a community that seemed to exhale with relief, as if Samuel's strange certainty had answered a question they hadn't known how to ask. Letter practice today, Clara announced on this particular Tuesday morning, spreading a clean slate across the small table she'd moved near the window. The late May sunshine streamed through the calico curtains, casting golden squares across Samuel's eager face. Can we do Papa's name first? Samuel asked, already reaching for the chalk. Thomas James Brennan. He never uses the James part, but Mama said it was important to know your whole name. Clara guided his hand through the letters, her fingers gentle over his. She'd discovered he learned best through touch and repetition, his mind quick but sometimes scattered like a bird, unable to decide which branch to light upon. Thomas, he spelled aloud, then frowned. Why isn't it spelled like it sounds, Thomas? English is full of mysteries, Clara said, smoothing his hair. It had become an unconscious gesture, this casual affection. Like why rough and through don't rhyme, even though they look like they should. Samuel considered this seriously, then brightened. Like how you and Papa pretend you're not sweet on each other, even though everyone can see it. Clara's hand stilled. Samuel. Mrs. Chen says Papa hasn't smiled this much since before Mama got sick. And you hum now. You didn't hum before. He returned to his letters, apparently considering the matter settled. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. She did hum now. She realized. Little snatches of melody that escaped without thought while she worked. The boarding house had noticed, too. Mrs. Van Holloway had commented just yesterday that the place felt livelier. "Let's work on your name now." Clara deflected. "Remember, the U comes after the Q." They worked until the lunch whistle blew. Samuel's letters gradually becoming more confident. Clara had borrowed a McGuffey reader from the schoolhouse, and they practiced with the simple moral tales that Samuel found alternately boring and fascinating. "Why's the boy in the story always good?" he asked, wrinkling his nose. "Real boys aren't always good. I put a frog in Jenny Patterson's lunch pail last month." "Was that kind?" Clara asked. Though she fought a smile, Jenny Patterson, daughter of the most judgmental woman in town, probably deserved worse than a frog. "No," Samuel admitted. "But she said you were probably a witch who enchanted me. So I showed her what real enchantment looked like: a frog jumping out of her cornbread." The lunch whistle meant Tom would be taking his break. Without discussion, it had become their routine. Clara and Samuel would walk to the mill with a dinner pail she'd prepared. Nothing fancy, just thick sandwiches and apple slices, maybe cookies if she'd had time to bake. But Tom's crew had noticed, making good-natured jokes about their boss's improved mood and sudden attention to his appearance. Today, Samuel ran ahead as always, his energy boundless despite the morning's lessons. Clara followed more slowly, the dinner pail heavy in her hands. She could hear the mill before she saw it, the screaming of saws, the thud of axes, the shouts of men working in dangerous harmony. Tom stood near the log pond, directing the placement of massive Douglas firs. His shirt was soaked with sweat, sawdust coating his arms like flour. When he saw them approaching, his face transformed, the hard concentration softening into something that made Clara's heart skip. "Papa!" Samuel launched himself at his father, who caught him easily despite the day's exhaustion. "Clara taught me to write acquaintance, and I only spelled it wrong twice. Only twice, that's better than your papa could do," Tom said, but his eyes were on Clara. "Thank you for bringing lunch. You don't have to." "I know," Clara interrupted. They had this exchange daily. He protested the kindness. She ignored the protest. It had become its own sort of dance. She spread a cloth on a fallen log, unpacking the meal with practiced efficiency. Other workers took their lunch nearby, nodding respectfully. Big Jim Morrison, the crew chief, had been the first to accept her presence. "Boy needs a woman's influence," he'd declared loudly enough for all to hear. "And Tom needs to stop looking like a ghost." As they ate, Samuel chattered about his morning, demonstrating his letters by drawing them in the sawdust with a stick. Clara listened with half her attention, the other half aware of Tom's presence, the way he sat carefully distant but angled toward her, as if she were a fire he needed but didn't dare approach too closely. "Show Papa the new song you taught me," Samuel demanded suddenly. Clara shook her head. "Songs are for quiet times, not lumber mills. Please." Samuel deployed the eyes that had yet to fail him. "The one about the rivers and mountains." Clara glanced at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. She began to hum, soft and low, an old hymn her grandmother had loved. Samuel joined in with the words he remembered, his young voice clear despite the mill's noise. She was watching Samuel, which is why she didn't see Tom's reaction at first. It was Big Jim's gasp that made her look up. Tom had gone rigid, his sandwich dropping from nerveless fingers. His face had drained of color, and his hands shook as he pressed them against his thighs. "That song," he whispered. "Emma sang it, the night she the last night. She said she was teaching it to the woman who would come after." His voice broke. "I thought it was the fever talking." The mill noise continued around them, but their small circle had gone silent. Samuel looked between them, his expression serene. "Mama knew things," he said simply. She knew Clara would come. She knew the songs to teach her. Clara's rational mind searched for explanations. Coincidence? common hymns everyone knew. But her heart recognized something deeper, a thread of connection that defied logic. "I learned it from my grandmother," she said quietly. "She came from Tennessee. Sang it while she worked." "Emma's people were from Tennessee," Tom said, "before they came west." Big Jim cleared his throat. "Well, ain't that something? Music traveling through families and time, finding its way to where it needs to be." He stood, brushing sawdust from his pants. "Back to work, boys. Logs don't split themselves." The crew dispersed, but not without curious glances. Tom remained seated, still shaken. Samuel had moved to lean against Clara, his small body a bridge between them. "I should go," Clara said softly. "You need to get back to work." "Stay," Tom said suddenly. "Just a few more minutes." She stayed. They sat in silence, watching the controlled chaos of the mill. Samuel dozed against Clara's shoulder, worn out from the morning's efforts. Without thinking, Clara began humming again a different song, wordless, something that came from the peaceful moment rather than memory. Tom's hand moved across the log, stopping just short of hers. "The crew's right. I've been a ghost. Samuel, too, in his way. But these past weeks..." He struggled for words. "It's like the house can breathe again." Clara turned her hand palm up. An invitation. After a long moment, Tom took it. His hand was rough, warm, steady. They sat that way for just a moment before the whistle called him back to work. But it was enough. A promise, maybe, or just an acknowledgement that whatever strange path had brought them together was worth walking a little further. That evening, as Clara walked Samuel home, they encountered Mrs. Chen at her garden gate. The older woman smiled, pressing a small paper packet into Clara's hands. "Flower seeds," she explained. "Morning glories. They climb and bloom even in difficult soil. Plant them with the boy. Gardens are good for healing." Samuel immediately began planning where they would plant them, his voice bright with excitement. Clara listened, the seeds warm in her palm. She thought about Emma's wildflower garden, overgrown but not forgotten. Maybe it was time to tend growing things again. At Tom's cabin, Samuel hugged her goodbye with his usual fierce intensity. Through the window, she could see Tom preparing supper, his movements sure but tired. He looked up, catching her watching, and raised his hand in a small wave. Walking back to the boarding house, Clara realized she was humming again. Not a learned song this time, but something new. Something that seemed to rise from the combination of sawdust and sunshine. Small hands learning letters, and larger ones finally remembering how to reach out. Mrs. Holloway met her at the door with knowing eyes. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by. Wanted to know your intentions regarding the Brennan family." "What did you tell her?" "That intentions are like seeds. You don't know what they'll grow into until you plant them and wait." That night, Clara pressed one of Samuel's wildflowers between the pages of her Bible. Indian paintbrush, vibrant orange-red, the color of hope she'd forgotten existed. Tomorrow he would come again, and she would teach him more letters. Tomorrow Tom would look at her with those careful, wanting eyes. Tomorrow the mill would scream and the town would whisper, and slowly, so slowly, they would all learn what it meant to choose each other. The lumber camp settled into evening, smoke rising from dozens of small cabins. Clara could hear the men singing their work songs, voices rough but harmonious. She found herself humming along, adding her voice to the chorus of Pine Ridge, no longer a stranger but not quite belonging. Not yet, but soon, perhaps, soon. Sunday arrived with a gentleness that seemed to bless their planned outing. Clara stood in Mrs. Holloway's kitchen at dawn, carefully packing the wicker basket she'd borrowed. Cold chicken from yesterday's supper, wrapped in clean muslin. Biscuits she'd risen early to bake, still warm. Their golden tops brushed with butter, a jar of strawberry preserves that Mrs. Holloway had contributed with a knowing wink, hard-boiled eggs, pickles, and a careful package of tea cakes she'd made the night before while thinking of Samuel's delighted face. "You're fussing like a new bride," Mrs. Holloway observed from the doorway, her voice kind. "Though I suppose, in a way, that's what you're becoming." Clara's hand stilled on the basket lid. "We're just having a picnic. Samuel's been asking to show me his fort." "Mm-hmm." The older woman's expression was fond. "And Tom Brennan just happens to be joining you, on his one day off, wearing his good shirt, according to Mrs. Chen, who saw him at the water pump this morning, washing like he was heading to church." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks but continued packing. 3 plates, real china ones that Mrs. Holloway insisted she use. 3 cups, 3 of everything, like a small miracle of mathematics that added up to something she didn't quite dare name. The knock came precisely at 9, as promised. Samuel burst through the door before Clara could answer, his excitement radiating like heat from a stove. "Clara, I found the perfect spot by the creek, and Papa says we can stay all afternoon if you want, and I brought my collecting jar for salamanders." Behind him, Tom filled the doorway, indeed wearing his good shirt, blue cotton that brought out the gray in his eyes. He'd trimmed his beard and his hair was still damp from washing. He carried a folded blanket over one arm and looked endearingly nervous. "Morning, Clara, Mrs. Holloway." He nodded to both women. "Thank you for this. Samuel hasn't talked about anything else all week. The boy needs adventures," Clara said, lifting the basket. "And I need to see more of Pine Ridge than the path between here and the mill." They set out into the morning, leaving the settlement behind for the forest paths that wound up into the hills. Samuel ran ahead, then circled back like an eager puppy, pointing out every landmark with proprietary pride. "That's the lightning tree, see where it's split. And that's where I saw the bear cub last spring, but Papa made me climb a tree while he scared the mama off." The forest was cathedral quiet, sunlight filtering through Douglas firs and cedars so tall Clara had to crane her neck to see their tops. The air smelled of pine pitch and earth, the dampness of hidden springs and growing things. Their footsteps were muffled by centuries of needlefall, and Clara found herself breathing deeper, as if she'd been holding her breath since arriving in Oregon. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and Tom smiled a real smile that transformed his usually solemn face. Emma loved it out here. Said it was where God kept his best thoughts. The path wound upward, sometimes narrow enough that they had to walk single file. Tom went first, holding branches aside for Clara, his hand occasionally extended to help her over fallen logs. Each small touch sent warmth through her fingers, a reminder of possibilities she'd thought burned away. "Here," Samuel announced suddenly, veering off the main path. "This is the secret way. The secret way involves scrambling over mossy rocks and ducking under low-hanging branches." Clara's skirts caught on blackberry vines, and she actually laughed as Tom carefully freed her while Samuel danced with impatience. The fort, when they reached it, was a marvel of childhood engineering. Built between 3 massive trees, with walls of woven branches and a roof of cedar boughs, it looked like something from a fairy story. "I built it myself," Samuel announced proudly. "Well, Papa helped with the roof and the floor and making sure it wouldn't fall down, but it was my idea." Inside, Clara found treasures arranged with careful precision. Colored stones on a bark shelf, feathers stuck into the walls, a collection of pine cones sorted by size. And in the corner, wrapped in oilcloth, a small daguerreotype of a woman with Samuel's eyes and Tom's smile. "That's Mama," Samuel said, noticing her attention. "I keep her here so she can see the forest. She liked to see growing things." Clara touched the image gently. Emma had been beautiful, with the kind of serene expression that suggested deep contentment. She was lovely. She was. Tom agreed quietly. Inside and out. They spread the blanket in a small clearing near the fort, where the creek gurgled over stones and the sunlight came down in sheets of gold. Samuel immediately went to the water's edge, turning over rocks and exclaiming over the creatures beneath. Clara unpacked their lunch, aware of Tom watching her movements with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. "I need to show you something," he said suddenly. "Samuel, stay where we can see you." He led her a short distance upstream to where the creek widened into a pool, and there, spreading from the banks in wild profusion, was a garden, or what had been a garden, columbine and lupine, Indian paintbrush and yarrow, all growing in planned chaos that was being slowly reclaimed by the forest. "Emma planted these," Tom said. "She'd come here when she was strong enough, teaching Samuel about the plants, their names, their uses. She called it her promise garden." "Promise?" Clara asked, though her throat was tight. "She said gardens were promises that next year would come, that things would keep growing even if the gardener wasn't there to see them." He knelt, pulling a few weeds from around a struggling rose bush. "The last time she was here, maybe a month before she died. She was so weak I had to carry her, but she insisted on planting one more thing there, by that rock." Clara looked where he pointed and gasped. Apple blossoms, a small tree, barely more than a sapling, but covered in delicate pink and white flowers that released their perfume into the warm air. "She said it was for the woman who would come," Tom continued, his voice rough. "She was so sure, so certain. She made me promise to bring you here when you arrived, made me swear I wouldn't let the garden die completely." Clara's vision blurred with tears. "I came here to disappear, not to be found. I ran from everything: my husband's grave, his family, the child who never lived. I thought if I went far enough west, I could escape the weight of it all." "Maybe," Tom said carefully. "You weren't running away. Maybe you were running toward—" They stood together in the overgrown garden, surrounded by Emma's promises and hopes. A butterfly landed on the apple tree, wings iridescent in the sunlight. From downstream came Samuel's voice, singing something tuneless and happy. "She dreamed about you," Tom said. "Not just at the end, but for months before. She'd wake up and describe you, your hands, your voice, the way you'd teach Samuel. She even knew about the wooden horse you carry." Clara's hand went to her pocket where the small toy rested. She'd taken to carrying it, a talisman of grief she couldn't release. How could she know? "I don't know. Emma said some things don't need explaining, just accepting. She wasn't afraid to die because she knew you were coming." His voice broke slightly. "She made it bearable, knowing Samuel wouldn't be motherless forever." "Samuel?" Clara called, needing the boy's presence to anchor her spinning world. He came running, jar in hand, water sloshing. "Look!" He held up the jar where a small salamander swam in circles. "Isn't he perfect? Can I keep him?" "Just for lunch," Clara said, wiping her eyes. "Then he goes back to his family." They returned to their picnic spot, the strange weight of destiny settling around them like the forest quiet. As they ate, Samuel chattered about his discoveries: the bird nest he'd found, the rocks that looked like faces, the place where otters sometimes played. After lunch, he grew drowsy in the warm sun, curling up on the blanket with his head in Clara's lap. She stroked his hair absently, watching the creek flash and murmur. Tom had moved closer, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. "I'm not her," Clara said quietly. "Emma. I'm not her replacement." "I know," Tom said. "I don't want you to be. She was my past, the mother of my child, and I'll always love her. But you—" He paused, searching for words. "You're not a replacement. You're what comes next. You're the answer to prayers I didn't even know to pray." Clara looked down at Samuel, peaceful in sleep, then at Tom, vulnerable in hope, and finally at the garden where promises grew wild. The salamander swam in its jar, waiting to go home, The apple tree released its perfume into the afternoon. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I've forgotten how to trust good things." "Then we'll remember together," Tom said. He reached out, not for her hand, but to touch the edge of her shawl, the gesture so tentative it made her heart ache. "If you'll stay." They sat in silence as the afternoon deepened. Eventually, Samuel woke, immediately asking about his salamander. They walked to the creek together to release it, Samuel explaining seriously to the creature that it could visit again next Sunday. As they prepared to leave, Samuel ran between them on the path, grabbing both their hands. For a moment they stood frozen in the tableau Clara had imagined a dozen times the three of them connected. Dappled sunlight painting them gold, looking like what they weren't yet but might become. "This was the best day," Samuel announced. "Can we do it again next week?" "If Clara wants to," Tom said carefully. Clara squeezed Samuel's hand, then, daringly, didn't release Tom's when the boy ran ahead to chase a squirrel. "I want to," she said. They walked back toward Pine Ridge as the sun slanted low, their shadows long on the path. Samuel found treasures: a perfect pine cone, an interesting stone, a feather he swore came from an eagle. Clara's basket was lighter now, filled with empty jars and memories instead of food. At the place where the path widened, Tom began to tell her about the lumber business, the contracts for the railroad, his plans to save enough to buy his own land someday. Clara found herself sharing too about teaching before marriage, her love of books, the garden she'd once tended. They were talking like people who expected to have time for all their stories. Weeks and months and years of Sunday afternoons to unspool their histories and dreams. The thought should have terrified Clara, but instead, she felt something unclenching in her chest, like roots finally finding water after a long drought. At the boarding house gate, Samuel hugged her fiercely. "The salamander liked you," he informed her. "I could tell." "How?" Clara asked, smiling. He swam in circles. "That means happiness in salamander language." Tom lingered after Samuel ran ahead. "Thank you," he said, "for today. For every day since you arrived." "I should be thanking you," Clara said, "for letting me in, for being patient with my fears." "Emma used to say patience was just another word for hope with good boots on," Tom said, "willing to walk as far as it takes." He touched his hat brim and turned to go, then stopped. "Clara, the apple tree, would you help me tend it? Make the garden grow again?" "Yes," she said, the word coming quick and certain. "Yes, I'll help." She watched them walk away, father and son. Their shadows merged into one long shape on the dusty road. The wicker basket bumped against her leg, light and empty. From somewhere in the settlement came the sound of evening singing, hymns rising like smoke from cabin to cabin. Clara climbed the boarding house steps, humming, in her pocket. The wooden horse was warm from the day's sun. Tomorrow Samuel would come for lessons. Tomorrow she'd see Tom at the mill. Tomorrow the garden would still be growing, wild but not forgotten, waiting for hands to tend it back to purpose. Mrs. Holloway met her at the door, took one look at her face, and smiled. So, it was a good day. It was a perfect day, Clara said, and meant it. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning that had begun like any other. Clara was teaching Samuel to write cursive letters, their heads bent together over the slate, when Mrs. Holloway knocked on her door. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, but something in her eyes made Clara's stomach tighten. "Post for you," Mrs. Holloway said, extending an envelope that looked like it had traveled through hell to reach her. "Forwarded from Salem, looks like." Clara's hand trembled as she took it. The envelope bore multiple postal marks: Salem, Portland, and finally, Pine Ridge. Someone had been determined to find her. The sealing wax on the back was black, official-looking, and her married name stared up at her like an accusation: Mrs. Clara Henley. "Bad news?" Samuel asked, His young face creased with worry. I don't know yet. Clara managed a smile. Why don't you practice your loops while I read this? But her hands shook too badly to open it properly. Mrs. Holloway quietly produced a letter opener, slitting the envelope with practiced efficiency. I'll be downstairs if you need anything, she said meaningfully, ushering Samuel out with promises of cookies. Alone. Clara unfolded the heavy paper. The letterhead made her blood turn cold. Thornbury and Associates. Attorneys at law, Kansas City. Her late husband's creditors had found her. The language was formal, threatening in its politeness. James Henley's debts, apparently, hadn't died with him, as his widow. She was responsible for the remaining obligations, nearly $300 owed to various merchants. The mortgage on the house she'd fled. And most horrifyingly, a loan he'd taken using her inheritance from her mother as collateral. They gave her 30 days to respond or face legal action. Clara sank onto her bed, the letter crumpling in her fist. $300. It might as well have been $3,000. She'd used almost everything to get to Oregon, keeping only enough to pay Mrs. Holloway and buy the barest necessities. She thought she'd escaped. Thought distance and her maiden name would be enough. But the past had tracked her down like a patient hunter, and now it threatened not just her, but the fragile new life she'd begun to build. The day passed in a haze. She went through the motions with Samuel, walked him to the mill for lunch with Tom, smiled and nodded at conversations she couldn't later remember. But inside, the old panic was rising, the trapped animal feeling that had driven her west in the first place. That evening, Tom noticed. Of course he did. He'd become attuned to her moods like a farmer to weather changes. What's wrong? He asked quietly while Samuel chased fireflies in the dusk. Nothing, she lied, but her voice cracked on the word. Tom studied her, then nodded slowly. When you're ready to tell me, I'll listen. She almost broke then, almost confessed everything. But shame held her tongue. How could she tell him about the debts, about James's cruelty that had escalated from words to fists, about the night she'd finally fought back and he'd fallen down the stairs? The death had been ruled accidental, but Clara knew the truth. She'd pushed him, not meaning for him to die, just to get away, but pushed nonetheless. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Clara lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, planning. She could leave before dawn, catch the first freight wagon heading anywhere else. California, maybe, or further north to Washington Territory. Somewhere the lawyers couldn't find her. By midnight, she was up and packing. The movements were familiar: fold the dresses, wrap the Bible, tuck the wooden horse in last. She'd done this before, in the dark hours after James's funeral, moving like a ghost through her own escape. The carpetbag was nearly full when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Too light to be Mrs. Holloway. Too uncertain to be a grown man. Clara froze. Hurricane lamp throwing wild shadows on the wall. Samuel appeared in her doorway like a small spirit, his flannel nightgown too big for his thin frame, his mother's rag doll clutched in one hand and his stuffed bear in the other. His feet were bare, and his eyes were enormous in the lamplight. Don't go. Mama Clara, he said, his voice small but certain. Please don't go. Samuel, what are you doing here? It's the middle of the night. Your father... Papa's sleeping, but I felt you leaving. He stepped into the room, and Clara saw he was crying, silent tears tracking down his cheeks. I felt it here. He pressed his hand to his chest, like when Mama was leaving, only different. Mama had to go. You're choosing to. Clara sank onto the bed, the fight going out of her. How did you even get here? I know the way. I always know the way to you. He climbed onto the bed beside her, curling against her side with the trust of a child who'd never been betrayed. Why do you want to leave? Did we do something wrong? No, sweet boy. You've done nothing wrong. Sometimes adults have problems that follow them. Papa says running makes you tired, Samuel interrupted. He used to run. After Mama died, he'd walk the forest all night, like he could run from being sad. But the sad just followed him, and he got tireder and tireder until one day he couldn't run anymore. That's when the sad started getting smaller. Clara pulled him closer, breathing in his little boy smell of soap and sun. Sometimes running is the only choice. No, Samuel said firmly. Papa says there's always choices. Even when they're all bad, you still get to pick. Pick us. Mama Clara, please pick us. The next morning came anyway, despite Clara's sleepless night. Samuel had eventually fallen asleep against her, and she'd carried him to Mrs. Holloway's sofa rather than wake him for the walk home. When Tom arrived at dawn, frantic, she'd had to explain, watching his face cycle through relief, confusion, and concern. He knew I was upset, Clara said carefully. Children know things. Tom studied his sleeping son, then her half-packed carpet bag visible through the open door. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just gathered Samuel in his arms. We'll see you at lunch. It was a question, not a statement. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. By afternoon, the entire town seemed to know something was wrong. Clara ventured to Paulson's general store for thread, hoping normalcy might steady her nerves. But Mrs. Patterson was there, holding court near the fabric counter, and her voice carried sharp and clear. Strange how she just appeared. No family, no references, and that poor boy, so desperate for a mother he'd latch on to anyone. Makes you wonder what kind of woman runs from her past. Clara's hands clenched on the thread. She could leave, avoid the confrontation, but suddenly she was tired of running from judgment, from sharp-tongued women who'd never known a cruel hand or a desperate choice. The kind who survives, Clara said clearly, stepping into view. The store went silent. Is that what you want to know, Mrs. Patterson? What kind of woman I am? Mrs. Patterson flushed but lifted her chin. A decent woman doesn't what? Clara interrupted, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. Doesn't flee a husband who broke her ribs, doesn't lose a child and have her grief thrown in her face daily, doesn't travel 2,000 miles to escape debts from a man who gambled away her mother's inheritance. She was crying now, but she didn't care. The other women in the store had frozen. Mrs. Chen by the sugar bins. Young Mrs. Morrison near the door. You want to know what kind of woman I am? I'm the kind who survived things that would have broken you. I'm the kind who came here with nothing but hope that distance might mean peace. I'm the kind who knows that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes you have to save yourself first. Clara. Tom's voice from the doorway. She hadn't heard him enter, but there he stood, sawdust in his hair, his face fierce with protective anger. That's enough. She doesn't deserve your truth. He crossed to her, his hand gentle on her elbow. You're better than this town deserves, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Better than I deserve. But we're lucky to have you anyway. Mrs. Patterson sputtered. But Mrs. Chen stepped forward. Clara's shown nothing but kindness since she arrived. She teaches the boy, helps at the mill, pays her rent promptly. What more proof of character do you need? She just admitted her husband, Mrs. Patterson started, is dead. Tom cut in flatly. And from what she said, good riddance. Not every marriage is blessed. Margaret, some are survival tests. Clara survived. That makes her strong, not suspicious. He steered Clara toward the door, but she stopped, turning back to the watching women. I'm not proud of running, but I'm not ashamed of surviving. And if that makes me the wrong kind of woman for Pine Ridge, I'll pack tonight. No. The voice was Samuel's. He stood in the doorway, having escaped from school, his face flushed from running. You can't make her leave. She's ours now. He threw himself at Clara, wrapping his arms around her waist. Tell them about the garden, Papa. Tell them about Mama's dreams. Tell them Clara's meant to be here." The store held its breath. Tom looked at his son, at Clara, at the town that waited for judgment or validation. "My wife dreamed of Clara before she died," he said simply. "Described her down to the silver in her hair. Emma knew someone was coming who'd need us as much as we needed her. You can call it fever dreams or coincidence, but my boy recognized her on sight, and my house has felt like home again since she arrived." He looked directly at Mrs. Patterson. "So you can gossip and judge Margaret, but you won't drive her off. She's under my protection and the protection of every decent person in this town." Big Jim Morrison stepped through the door, several other mill workers behind him. "That's right," he rumbled. "Clara's one of us now. Anyone has a problem with that can take it up with the entire mill crew." Mrs. Patterson retreated, her face pinched with thwarted malice, but Clara barely noticed. She was looking at Samuel's fierce little face, at Tom's protective stance, at the circle of support that had formed without her realizing she'd earned it. "The letter," she whispered to Tom. "There are debts. We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "Together. No more running. Clara, you've run far enough." Samuel looked up at her, his eyes wise beyond their years. "See, Papa says we get to pick. Even when choices are hard, pick us. Mama Clara, we pick you." Standing in the general store, surrounded by pickle barrels and bolts of fabric, witnessed by half the town, Clara felt the last of her resistance crumble. She was tired of running, tired of carrying shame for crimes that weren't hers, tired of being afraid. "All right," she said softly, then louder. "All right, I'll stay." Samuel whooped, the mill workers cheered, and Mrs. Bien Chen smiled her quiet smile. Tom's hand found Clara's, steady and sure, a promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The credit ledger on Paulson's counter lay open, recording debts and payments, the endless tally of what was owed. But standing there, Clara thought about different kinds of debts, the ones paid in kindness, in second chances, in the fierce love of a child who'd claimed her as his own. Those debts, she was learning, were the only ones worth counting. The accident whistle shattered the afternoon quiet like breaking glass. Clara had been mending one of Samuel's shirts, the needle frozen mid-stitch as the sound pierced through Pine Ridge. 3 long blasts, then 2 short, the pattern that meant injury at the mill. That meant someone's blood was mixing with sawdust. She was running before conscious thought formed, the shirt dropping forgotten to the floor. Her feet knew the path by heart now. 3 weeks of daily walks having worn the knowledge into her bones. Other women were running too, Mrs. Morrison, her face white with fear, Mrs. Chen clutching her apron. The whistle only blew for serious injuries. In a lumber town, serious meant life-threatening. The mill yard was chaos when she arrived. Men clustered near the main saw, their faces grim. Clara pushed through, her heart hammering against her ribs, searching for Samuel's small form. She found him first, standing with his teacher Miss Winters near the office, his face streaked with tears but whole, unharmed. Then she saw Tom. He lay on a makeshift stretcher of pine planks, his face gray as morning ash. His right side was soaked with blood, his breathing shallow and pained. Big Jim Morrison knelt beside him, pressing a wadded shirt against the wound. "Tree kicked back," Jim said tersely when he saw Clara. "Caught him in the ribs. Doc Hartley's coming." But Clara was already kneeling, her hands steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. She'd seen injuries before James had made sure of that, but never like this, never on someone who mattered. "Let me see," she said, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed. Jim lifted the compress, and Clara bit back a gasp. The bark had torn through shirt and skin, leaving a gash that ran from armpit to hip. She could see the white of broken ribs through the blood. "Get me clean water, as hot as you can," she ordered. "And whiskey. All you have. Someone find carbolic acid. Paulson's will have it. And clean sheets. Many as you can find." The men scattered to obey, grateful for direction. Clara turned to Samuel, who had broken free from his teacher and stood frozen, staring at his father's still form. "Samuel, love, I need you to be very brave," Clara said, keeping her voice calm. "Your papa needs our help. Can you run to Mrs. Holloway and tell her to prepare the downstairs room, clean sheets on the bed, water boiling on the stove? Tell her to send all the laudanum she has." Samuel nodded, his small face set with determination. He took off running, his legs pumping furiously. Clara turned back to Tom, whose eyes had fluttered open. "Clara." His voice was barely a whisper. "Samuel." "He's fine. He's safe. Now stop talking and save your strength." Doc Hartley arrived, his medical bag banging against his leg as he hurried over. He was young for a doctor, barely 30, but his hands were sure as he examined Tom's injuries. "3 ribs broken, maybe 4, he muttered. "The gash needs cleaning and stitching. Lost blood, but not so much we can't manage." He looked at Clara. "I'll need assistance. The men get squeamish when it comes to needlework on flesh." "I'll help," Clara said immediately. They moved Tom to his cabin, 6 men carrying the stretcher with infinite care. Clara had expected resistance to her presence in Tom's home, but none came. The emergency had dissolved proper boundaries, or perhaps the town had already decided she belonged there. The next hours passed in a blur of blood and carbolic acid, whiskey used for sterilization and pain management both. Clara held Tom's shoulders while Doc Hartley set the ribs, feeling the bones grind back into place. She threaded needles with silk for the doctor's careful stitches, 47 in all, each one closing the terrible gash bit by bit. Through it all, Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out, sometimes muttering Emma's name, sometimes reaching for Clara's hand with desperate strength. "Don't leave," he said once, clearly, his eyes focusing on her face. "Please don't leave us." "Never," Clara promised, and meant it. By nightfall, the immediate danger had passed. Tom lay in his own bed, bandaged and dosed with laudanum, his breathing easier though still pained. Doc Hartley had shown Clara how to change the dressings, how to watch for fever, how to measure the laudanum drops. "He'll need constant care for at least 2 weeks, the doctor said, washing his hands in the basin. "Someone will need to." "I'll stay," Clara said. "I'll care for him." The doctor studied her, taking in her blood-stained dress, her determined face, and the boy. "I'll care for them both." Samuel had been silent through the doctoring, watching from the corner with eyes too old for his years. Now, as the doctor left, he crept to Clara's side. "Is Papa going to die?" he whispered. Clara pulled him close, feeling his small body tremble. "No, sweet boy. Your Papa is strong. He's going to heal, but he'll need our help." "I can help," Samuel said fiercely. "I know where everything is. I can make coffee and fetch water, and I know you can," Clara said, kissing his head. "You're the bravest boy I know." His brave face lasted exactly 10 more seconds before crumbling entirely. He sobbed against Clara's chest, great gasping sobs that shook his whole frame. "I was so scared," he choked out. "They said a tree fell and Papa was hurt and there was blood everywhere, and I thought, shh," Clara soothed, rocking him like the baby he still partly was. "Papa's here. He's hurt, but he's here. We're not going to lose him. Promise. I promise." That night, Clara kept watch. She sat in the wooden chair beside Tom's bed, checking his breathing, monitoring his temperature, administering laudanum when he stirred in pain. Samuel had fallen asleep on the small cot in the corner, exhausted from fear and crying. Near dawn, Tom woke properly, his eyes clear despite the pain. "Clara?" His voice was rough. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed." She helped him sip water, supporting his head. "Where else would I be? Your reputation staying here unchaperoned." "Hang my reputation," Clara said firmly. "You need care. Samuel needs stability." That matters more than what Mrs. Patterson thinks. Tom studied her face in the lamplight. You're taking care of us. Someone has to. You lumbermen are terrible at it yourselves. He managed a small smile, then winced as it pulled his ribs. The crew they need, already handled, Clara said. Big Jim's taking over as temporary foreman. I've got the worksheets here. We went through them together. The railroad order will be filled on time. Tom stared at her. You organize the crew schedules. You forget I was a teacher. I can read worksheets and make sense of numbers. Besides, Jim did most of it. I just wrote it down properly. Over the next days, Clara discovered she could do more than she'd imagined. She managed 2 households, keeping Tom's cabin running while maintaining her responsibilities at the boarding house. She changed bandages with steady hands, brewed willow bark tea for pain, applied mustard plasters to prevent pneumonia. She reviewed crew schedules each evening with Big Jim, her teacher's handwriting making sense of the complicated work orders. The town rallied around them in ways that surprised Clara. Mrs. Holloway appeared daily with soup and bread, taking Samuel for a few hours so Clara could rest. Mrs. Chen brought herbal remedies from her homeland, mysterious teas that seemed to ease Tom's pain better than laudanum. Even Mrs. Patterson sent a pie, though she had her daughter deliver it. Town's decided, Mrs. Holloway said one afternoon, watching Clara spoon broth into Tom's mouth. You belong here. No debate anymore. Pastor Williams visited on the 4th day, his kind face concerned as he surveyed the scene, Clara exhausted but determined. Samuel reading to his father from his primer. Tom awake but weak. Sometimes God sends angels unaware, the pastor said quietly to Clara, but sometimes he makes it perfectly clear when an angel has arrived. By the end of the first week, Tom could sit up, though movement still caused significant pain. Clara had developed a routine morning medicines, breakfast for 3, Samuel to school, laundry and cleaning, lunch, crew schedules, dinner, evening medicines, Samuel's bedtime, and then the quiet hours watching Tom sleep. It was during one of these quiet hours that she realized the truth that had been building since the accident. She was no longer planning to leave. Somewhere between the blood and the fear and the daily care, she'd stopped thinking of herself as temporary. This cabin had become home. These people had become family. The second week brought improvement. Tom could walk short distances, though Clara insisted he rest more than he wanted. She caught him trying to review the crew schedules himself and firmly confiscated them. You're worse than Samuel, she scolded. Rest means rest. I'm not used to being idle, Tom protested. Then get used to it. Your body needs to heal. He caught her hand as she turned away. Clara, what you've done I can never repay. There's nothing to repay, she said softly. This is what people do. They take care of each other. Is that what we are? He asked. People taking care of each other? Clara looked at him, this good man who'd offered her protection when she was ready to run, who'd stood up for her against gossip, who trusted her with his son and his life. We're family, she said simply. Chosen family. Maybe, but family nonetheless. That night, after Samuel was asleep and Tom was dozing from his evening medicine, Clara stood in the cabin doorway looking out at Pine Ridge. The mill had gone quiet for the night, lanterns glowing in windows like earthbound stars. She could hear singing from somewhere the lumberjacks at their evening leisure. Samuel stirred in his sleep, mumbling something indistinct. Without thinking, Clara went to him, smoothing his hair, adjusting his blanket. He settled, sighing contentedly. Love you, Mama Clara, he murmured, still mostly asleep. Clara's heart seized. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I love you too, she whispered, the words coming natural as breathing. I love you too, my brave boy. Standing there in the lamplight, surveying this domain she'd chosen to protect the injured man healing in his bed, the child peaceful in sleep, the cabin that had become home, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just peace or safety or belonging, but purpose. She'd come west to disappear, but instead she'd been found. Found by a child's recognition, a man's trust, a town's acceptance. The morning would bring more medicines to administer, schedules to review, meals to prepare. There would be setbacks and struggles, the ongoing challenge of Tom's recovery, the looming threat of the legal letters she still hadn't told him about. But for now, in this quiet moment between darkness and dawn, Clara stood guard over her chosen family and knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The quilting bee was being planned for next month, she'd heard. The women wanted her to join them, to add her stitches to the communal creation. She would go. Clara decided. She would add her thread to the pattern, her story to the larger narrative of Pine Ridge. She would stop being the widow nobody knew and become simply Clara Teacher, healer, mother, and perhaps someday soon, wife. For now, though, she was the guardian at the door, the protector of this small kingdom of healing and hope. And that, she thought as she closed the door against the night, was enough. More than enough, it was everything. And 3 weeks had passed since the accident, and Tom could finally move without wincing. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he made his slow way across the yard, testing his strength against the morning chores. She'd tried to stop him, of course, but he'd given her that look, half-stubborn male pride, half-desperate need to be useful again. "You fuss worse than a mother hen," he'd said, but his eyes had been warm. Now she prepared breakfast, listening to Samuel chattering outside as he helped his father feed the chickens. Their voices carried on the June air, comfortable and familiar. She found herself humming as she worked, that unconscious music that seemed to spring from contentment. "You've made this place a home again." Clara turned to find Tom in the doorway, his expression serious. He'd been watching her, she realized, studying her movements in his kitchen with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "It was always a home," she said. "Just needed tending?" "No," Tom said quietly, stepping closer. "It was a house. 4 walls and a roof where Samuel and I existed. You made it home." He was close enough now that she could smell the cedar shavings on his clothes, see the faint lines pain had carved around his eyes. His hand came up, hesitating just before touching her cheek. "Clara, I need to say something. Should have said it days ago, but I was afraid." "Papa, Papa." Samuel burst through the door, vibrating with excitement. "I found something in the attic. Come see." The moment shattered. Tom dropped his hand, stepping back, and Clara turned to the stove, though nothing needed stirring. But Samuel was already tugging at his father's sleeve, his urgency impossible to ignore. "It's Mama's special box," Samuel explained as they climbed the narrow attic stairs. "The one she said not to open until the right time. I was looking for my old boots, and there it was, just sitting on top of the trunk, and it was open." The attic was dusty, lit by a single window that painted everything gold. There, on an old trunk, sat a wooden box Clara recognized Emma's Bible box, the one Samuel had mentioned that first day. But now it was open, revealing not just a Bible but a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and handling. Tom picked it up with trembling hands. "Her diary," he said softly. "I didn't know she kept one." "Read it, Papa," Samuel urged. "Read what she wrote." They descended to the kitchen, the journal precious as gold in Tom's hands. Clara poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. Whatever was in those pages, she sensed it would change things. Tom opened to a page near the end, marked with a pressed wildflower. His voice was rough as he began to read, May 15th, 1881. "The dreams are stronger now. She comes every night. The woman with dark hair going silver at the temples. Her hands are gentle but marked by old pain. I can see the shadow of a wedding ring she no longer wears. She carries something wooden, a child's toy, close to her heart. Last night I saw her clearer than ever. She was standing in our kitchen, making breakfast, humming the mountain song my grandmother taught me. Samuel was showing her his letters on the slate. They looked so right together, so natural, as if she'd always been there. Clara gasped, her hand going to her pocket where the wooden horse rested. Tom looked up at her, his eyes wide, then continued reading. May 20th, 1881. I'm dying. Dr. Hartley pretends otherwise, but I know the cough takes more of me each day. But I'm not afraid anymore. She's coming, the woman who'll love them when I can't. I see her so clearly now. She'll arrive on a Friday, wearing brown calico, carrying everything she owns. She'll smell of apple blossoms. Samuel will know her immediately, run to her without hesitation. She'll try to leave. She's been hurt so badly she's forgotten how to stay, but they'll heal each other. All three of them. Tom's voice broke. He cleared his throat and continued. May 25th, 1881. Told Tom about her today. He thinks it's fever dreams, but I know better. Some knowings come from beyond fever, beyond reason. She's traveling even now, though she doesn't know her destination yet. A widow, like Tom will be, carrying grief like stones in her pocket. But she'll come. I've seen her teaching Samuel, seen her tending my garden, seen her standing beside Tom at a barn raising while the whole town watches and knows they belong together. Clara was crying now, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Samuel had moved to lean against her, his small hand in hers. There's more, Tom said, turning to the final entry, May 30th, 1881. Last words, maybe, Tom. When you read this, and you will, when the time is right, know that I loved you completely. Know that leaving you breaks my heart. But know, too, that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, passes on, finds new vessels. The woman who's coming isn't my replacement. She's my gift to you, and you to her. Love her. Tom, let her love you. Let her love our son. She's been so alone, so hurt. She needs you both as much as you need her. Her name is Clara. She'll claim she came west to disappear, but really she came to be found. Find her, my love. Keep her. Be happy. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Clara stood frozen, her rational mind trying to explain the impossible. How could Emma have known? How could she have seen the lullaby? Clara whispered. The mountain song. My grandmother was from Tennessee. She taught it to me when I was small. Emma's grandmother was from the same county, Tom said. Came west on the same wagon train as yours. Most likely. Samuel looked between them, his expression serene. Mama knew things, he said simply. She knew when the robin would build her nest in the exact same spot. She knew when the first snow would come. She knew Clara would come. Tom set the journal down carefully, then stood. He crossed to Clara, his movements deliberate despite his healing ribs. This time, when he raised his hand to her cheek, he didn't hesitate. Emma would want this, he said softly. But more than that, I want this. I want you, Clara. Not because of dreams or prophecies, but because you've shown me how to live again instead of just survive. Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. I'm scared, she admitted. I've made such terrible choices before. Then we'll make better ones together, Tom said. Stay, Clara. Not because Emma saw it. Not because Samuel needs you. But because He stopped, swallowed, tried again. Because I love you. I've been falling in love with you since you stood in the market square and didn't run when my son called you Mama. Before Clara could respond, the sound of wagons and voices filled the yard. Samuel ran to the window, then whooped with delight. It's everyone, the whole town. And it was. Big Jim Morrison led the procession, wagons loaded with lumber. Behind him came what seemed like every able-bodied man in Pine Ridge, and their wives with baskets of food. Clara recognized the preparations of barn raising, though she hadn't heard of anyone needing a barn. What's happening? She asked. Tom looked as surprised as she felt, but Big Jim was already at the door, grinning broadly. Heard you were feeling better, boss, he said. Figured it was time to finish that addition you started planning before Emma took sick. The one for a bigger kitchen and a proper woman's parlor. I didn't ask, Tom started. Didn't have to, Jim interrupted. Town's decided. Clara's staying. Aren't you, ma'am? So the house needs to be ready for a family. A proper family. The men were already unloading lumber, marking positions, organizing with the efficiency of long practice. The women set up tables in the shade, covering them with cloths and dishes. Mrs. Holloway directed the food arrangement with military precision while Mrs. Chen organized the quilting frame. They'd work on the communal quilt while the men built. Clara stood overwhelmed as the town transformed the Brennan yard into a celebration of community purpose. These people had come together not just to build walls, but to make a statement. Clara belonged here. Speech, someone called out. Let's hear from Tom. Tom was pushed forward, his face reddening. But when he spoke, his voice carried clear and strong. You all know I'm no good at speeches, but Clara needs to hear this, and you all need to witness it. He turned to face her directly. Clara's shown us that home isn't just a place you build with lumber and nails. It's a choice you make every day to stay, to care, to belong. She chose us, Samuel and me, when she had every reason to run. Now we're choosing her. The crowd murmured approval. Elder Peterson, the unofficial patriarch of Pine Ridge, stepped forward. His weathered face was serious as he studied Clara. Young woman, he said, though Clara was hardly young. This town's seen its share of mystery. We've seen men arrive with blood on their hands and become our best citizens. We've seen women fleeing God knows what become the backbone of our community. Some things can't be explained, just accepted. He paused, his eyes moving to Samuel. Boy knew you belonged here before any of us. Children see clearer sometimes. He raised his voice so all could hear. I say Clara Freeman, or whatever name she chooses to carry, is one of ours. Anyone disagrees can take it up with me. No one disagreed. Instead, a cheer went up, and suddenly Clara was surrounded by women hugging her, men tipping their hats, children dancing around her skirts. The barn raising began in earnest, hammers ringing like bells, saws singing through wood. Clara found herself at the quilting frame, her needle moving in rhythm with the other women's. The pattern emerged slowly, a tree of life, its branches reaching toward stars. Each woman added her own stitches, her own interpretation of leaves and birds and hope. This will be yours, Mrs. Holloway said quietly. A wedding gift. When you're ready. Clara's needle paused, but only for a moment. Thank you, she said simply. As the sun reached its peak, the frame of the addition stood complete. The men broke for dinner, gathering around tables groaning with food. Clara helped serve, moving naturally among these people who'd claimed her. Tom watched her, his expression soft with something that looked like wonder. Samuel darted between adults, his face bright with joy. At one point, he stopped beside Clara, tugging her skirt. Are you happy, Mama Clara? She knelt to his level, cupping his face in her hands. Yes, sweet boy. Happier than I knew I could be. Good, he said firmly, because Mama said you would be. She said we'd all be happy again, once you came home. The afternoon continued with music starting up fiddles and harmonicas. Someone had brought a drum. Couples began dancing in the cleared space, the older folks teaching the younger ones the steps. Tom appeared at Clara's elbow, offering his hand. I'm not much of a dancer, he warned. Neither am I, Clara admitted, but they danced anyway, careful of his healing ribs, moving together with more tenderness than grace. Around them, Pine Ridge celebrated not just a barn raising, but a recognition, an acceptance, a blessing on what was becoming. As the sun began to sink, painting everything gold, Elder Peterson called for attention. He stood on a makeshift platform, his voice carrying over the gathering. We've built good walls today, he said. But more than that, we've built community. We've shown Clara Freeman what Pine Ridge does. We take in those who need us, and we become better for it. He raised his cup of cider, To the Brennan family, all three of them, may their house be filled with love, their table with plenty, and their hearts with peace. The toast echoed across the yard. Clara felt Tom's arm come around her waist. Samuel pressed against her other side. She thought of Emma's diary, of dreams and prophecies and impossible knowledge. But more than that, she thought of choice, the daily choice to stay, to trust, to love. The fiddles started up again, a familiar tune, the mountain song, the one both their grandmothers had known. Clara began to hum, then sing, her voice joining with others who knew the words. Tom's voice rumbled beneath hers. Samuel's piped above. The three of them stood together as the town sang around them, and Clara felt the last of her old life release its hold. She was no longer the widow nobody met, no longer the woman running from shadows. She was Clara who taught Samuel his letters, who'd nursed Tom through injury, who made the Brennan house a home. She was Clara who was loved, who was chosen, who belonged. Tomorrow there would be details to sort, the legal matters to address, the addition to complete, the conversation with Tom to finish. But tonight, surrounded by the community that had claimed her, standing between the man she loved and the child who'd recognized her soul, Clara felt the truth settle into her bones. She was home. The stars came out one by one, and still the celebration continued, and in the attic of the house. Emma's diary lay open to the final page, the pressed wildflower still marking the spot where prophecy became truth, where three broken hearts learned to beat as one. The morning after the barn raising, Clara found Tom at his desk, writing with the careful concentration of a man unused to correspondence. Legal documents spread before him, the letter from Thornberry and Associates she'd finally shown him, her marriage certificate, papers she didn't recognize. "What are you doing?" she asked, setting down his coffee. He didn't look up, his pen continuing its deliberate path across the paper. "Setting things right. Tom, those debts aren't your responsibility. They will be." He set down the pen, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm writing to the lawyers in Kansas City. As your husband, I'll assume all debts from your previous marriage. The law is clear on that." Clara's legs went weak. She sank into the chair across from him. "We're not married." "We will be." He leaned back, studying her with those steady gray eyes. "Unless you have objections. That's not, you can't just—" Clara struggled for words. "That's not a proposal. Tom Brennan." A small smile tugged at his lips. "No, it's not." He stood, came around the desk, and knelt beside her chair. From his pocket, he pulled a simple gold band, not new, worn smooth with age. "This was my grandmother's," he said softly. "Emma wore it for our marriage, then gave it back before she died, said to save it for you." Clara's breath caught. "She didn't." "She did. Even had your initials engraved inside C.F. Clara Freeman. Though I'm hoping you'll consider becoming Clara Brennan instead." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle. "I'm not good with pretty words, Clara, but I know this: you've brought light back into our darkness. You've given Samuel a mother's love again. You've shown me that hearts can heal, can love again after loss. I know we've only known each other 2 months, but sometimes the heart doesn't need time to recognize home. Marry me," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because of prophecies or dreams, not because of debts or propriety, but because I love you, because Samuel loves you, because life makes sense when you're here and falls apart when you're not." Clara looked at this good man kneeling before her, offering not just protection but partnership, not just safety but love. She thought of all the reasons to say no too fast, too complicated, too much risk. Then she thought of Samuel's face when he called her mama, of Tom's smile over morning coffee, of the garden waiting to be tended. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely a whisper, then stronger. "Yes, I'll marry you." Tom slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. He stood, pulling her up with him, and kissed her soft and sweet and full of promise. "When?" Clara asked when they parted. Saturday, Tom said. 4 days, unless you want longer. Saturday's perfect. She touched the ring, feeling its weight, its history. Where? The forest grove. Where Emma's garden grows. Where you first said you'd stay. The news spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. By afternoon, the entire town knew, and the women had mobilized. Mrs. Holloway took charge of the cake, declaring she'd been preparing for this since Clara's first week. Mrs. Chen produced a length of silk she'd been saving soft blue like a summer sky. Something new, she said, pressing it into Clara's hands. For happiness. Mrs. P. Morrison appeared with a veil of fine lace. Something borrowed. Wore it at my own wedding 20 years ago. Even Mrs. Patterson came, somewhat shamefaced, carrying a small velvet box. Inside lay a pearl hair comb, delicate and beautiful. Something old, she said stiffly. Been in my family 3 generations. Every bride in Pine Ridge has worn it for luck. She paused, then added more softly. I was wrong about you. You're good for them. Samuel was beside himself with excitement, dancing around the cabin, practicing his role as ring bearer with a brass button substituting for the real rings. I knew you'd marry Papa, he announced. Mama said you would. She said you'd stand under the apple tree, and I'd be right there in the middle, and everyone would cry, but happy tears. Friday evening. Clara sat in her room at the boarding house for the last time, penning a letter to James's family in Kansas. She explained her remarriage, included Tom's letter assuming the debts, and felt the last chains of her old life fall away. At the bottom, she signed her new name, Clara Brennan. The letters looked right, felt right on the page. Saturday dawned clear and perfect, the July sun gentle rather than scorching. Clara dressed in her best dress brown calico, the same one she'd worn arriving in Pine Ridge, but now adorned with Mrs. Chen's blue silk as a sash, the pearl comb holding the borrowed veil. She looked in the mirror and saw not the frightened widow who'd stepped off the freight wagon, but a woman transformed by love and choice. Tom and Samuel waited at the forest grove. The entire town gathered in a circle among the trees. Someone had woven wildflowers into garlands, draping them tree to tree. Emma's apple tree stood in full summer leaf, a few late blossoms still clinging to its branches. The overgrown garden had been cleared enough to make a natural aisle, lined with lupines and Indian paintbrush. Pastor Williams stood ready, his worn Bible in hand. But it was Samuel who drew Clara's attention, standing so straight and proud in his Sunday best, the rings tied to a small pillow with ribbon, his face glowing with joy. Big Jim Morrison escorted Clara down the makeshift aisle, having claimed the honor as the one who'd first accepted her. But Clara only had eyes for Tom, standing tall despite his recent injury, his face soft with wonder as he watched her approach. Who gives this woman to be married? Pastor Williams asked. She gives herself, Big Jim answered, as they'd discussed, free and clear, of her own choosing. Clara took her place beside Tom, and Samuel immediately stepped between them, looking up with those extraordinary eyes. Dearly beloved, Pastor Williams began, but Samuel tugged at his coat. Can I say something first? He asked. The pastor looked to Tom, who nodded. Samuel turned to face the assembled town. I knew she'd come, he said clearly. Mama told me, and I told Papa, even when he didn't believe me. I knew because Mama showed me in dreams. But also, I knew because... He paused, thinking. Because sometimes families aren't just born. They're made, like furniture or gardens or houses. You have to build them careful and strong. He looked up at Clara. I knew you'd come, Mama. I told Papa you would. And now you're here forever. There wasn't a dry eye in the grove. Clara knelt, pulling Samuel close, kissing his forehead. Forever, she promised. The ceremony continued, simple and beautiful. Tom's voice was strong as he spoke his vows, promising to cherish and protect. Clara's was clear as she promised to love and honor. When Pastor Williams pronounced them married, when Tom kissed her there under the apple tree with Samuel whooping between them, the entire town erupted in celebration. But it was afterward, during the quiet moment while the town set up for the harvest dance back in Pine Ridge, that the most precious moment came. Samuel pulled the wooden horse from his pocket, the toy Clara had carried across the continent. "This is yours," he said, offering it to her. "But now it's home, so you don't need to carry it anymore. We can put it on the shelf, where family things go." Clara accepted the little horse with trembling hands. "Thank you, sweet boy." "It's not sad anymore," Samuel observed. "The horse. Before it was sad, but now it's happy because it has a family." The harvest celebration that evening transformed Pine Ridge into a fairyland of lanterns and music. The new addition to the Brennan house, now the Brennan family house, stood complete, its windows glowing with candles. Tables groaned under the weight of the harvest feast roasted meats, fresh bread, apple pies, corn pudding, pickled vegetables, and barrel after barrel of fresh apple cider from the Petersons' press. Clara danced with Tom, with Samuel, with Big Jim, with Elder Peterson. She helped serve food, accepted congratulations, felt herself woven ever deeper into the fabric of the town. The photographer from Salem had come specially, setting up his equipment to capture the formal portraits that would mark this day. The final photograph was the one that would sit on their mantel for decades, Tom seated, Clara standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder, Samuel in front of them, all three faces serious as the long exposure demanded, but their eyes bright with joy. As the evening wound down, as families drifted home and the music softened to lullabies, Clara stood in the doorway of her new home. The addition smelled of fresh lumber and possibilities. Through the window, she could see the apple tree in the distance, silver in the moonlight. Tom came up behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "Happy, more than happy," Clara said. Complete. Samuel had fallen asleep on the new parlor sofa, exhausted from the day's excitement. Together, they carried him to his bed, tucking him in with the same practiced movements, already moving like partners who'd been together for years. Later, in their own room, Clara sat at the small writing desk Tom had moved in for her. By lamplight, she opened her journal not for escape plans or desperate prayers, but to record joy. July 14th, 1883. Today I married Tom Brennan. Today I became Samuel's mother-in-law as well as heart. Today I stopped running and chose to stand still, to plant roots, to grow. Emma knew I would come how. I'll never understand. But perhaps understanding isn't necessary. Perhaps it's enough to know that sometimes broken people find each other, that grief can transform into joy, that families can be chosen as well as born. Found by being lost, whole by being broken. These were the words I thought earlier. And they're true. I came to Pine Ridge to disappear, but instead I was seen, truly seen, by a child who needed a mother and a man who needed a partner. The woman who stepped off that freight wagon 3 months ago wouldn't recognize the woman writing these words. That woman was all sharp edges and fear. This woman is soft with love, strong with purpose. Tomorrow we'll wake in our new home. I'll make breakfast while Tom does morning chores. Samuel will practice his letters. We'll walk to church together, sit in the same pew, be what we've become, a family. The debts are handled. Tom has taken them as his own, though we'll pay them together from the mill profits. The past is settled. The future stretches ahead, bright with ordinary days and small miracles. The wooden horse sits on the mantel now, next to Emma's photograph and our wedding portrait. It's not a burden anymore, but a reminder of the child I lost, the journey I took, the family I found. Samuel was right. It's not sad anymore. It's home. Clara set down her pen, closed the journal. Through the walls, she could hear Tom's steady breathing, Samuel's occasional mumble. The house settled around them, wood adjusting to night temperatures, making small sounds like a creature getting comfortable. She blew out the lamp and made her way to bed in the darkness, guided by instinct and belonging. Outside, Pine Ridge slept under its blanket of stars. The mill stood silent, waiting for Monday's work. The apple tree in Emma's garden rustled in the night breeze, its branches reaching toward tomorrow. 3 shadows merged into one on the cabin wall where another lamp still burned, Tom reading. Clara beside him. Samuel's door opened so they could hear if he called out. But he wouldn't call out tonight. Tonight. All 3 hearts beat in rhythm. All 3 griefs had transformed into one unified joy. The widow nobody met had become the wife everybody knew, the mother everybody recognized, the woman everybody claimed as their own. And in the morning, she would wake to her chosen life, her chosen family, her chosen home, and know that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in running but in standing still, in saying yes, in choosing love despite the fear. The harvest moon rose full and golden over Pine Ridge, blessing the town, the forest, and the small cabin where 3 people who'd been lost had finally found their way home to each other. Clara's journey from desperate flight to chosen family reveals a profound truth about gratitude and belonging. She arrived in Pine Ridge carrying the injustice of blame for a child who never drew breath, for a husband's cruelty she never caused, for debts she never created. Yet through Samuel's innocent recognition and Tom's patient love, she discovered that family isn't always about blood or obligation. Sometimes it's about the grateful choosing of one another, day after day. The story shows us that gratitude can transform even the deepest wounds. Clara's gratitude for Samuel's unconditional acceptance, Tom's protective strength, and the community's eventual embrace allowed her to stop running and start building. In return, her presence brought gratitude into the Brennan home, for laughter returned, for maternal love renewed, for the completion of their fractured family, most powerfully. This tale reminds us that those who seem most broken often carry the greatest capacity for gratitude and love. Clara didn't replace Emma. She became the answer to Emma's grateful prayers, proving that families can be divinely orchestrated through loss, hope, and the courage to stay. Have you ever been unfairly blamed for circumstances beyond your control? Like Clara was blamed for her stillborn child. How did you find your way to forgiveness of others or yourself?